Hello, I'm Mishka, and this channel is the Helsinki Renaissance, where we will be talking about some arts and culture related matters uh, in hopefully uh, such a fresh and interesting manner that we will render this activity somewhat worthwhile by so doing. Anyway, I already made one video about uh, responding to something that I saw in a video by another YouTube channel called Veritasium, and um, there was a different thing that kept bothering me, or maybe bother is the wrong word, but it's something that stayed with me after I watched one video uh, where the gentleman from the Veritasium channel he was talking in some sort of a classroom about um, the basically about the online culture and how he hoped initially that the internet could be some sort of a revolutionary instrument in Western civilization that would bring forth some sort of uh, availability of high culture to everyone on the planet. But then initially it seemed to him, as he was observing how the world was changing, that things were going towards the better direction. It seemed like democracy was spreading to countries that didn't have it, and that science videos were available to all the world, and that everyone could self-publish without having an over-reliance on the media conglomerates and so on. That it seemed that internet was making life rosy for all of us, but then the problem came that basically he said that internet can make good things available, but it can also make bad things available, and then bad things started becoming available, and then he was talking about how some fake news can start spreading, and people don't exactly watch science videos 24/7, and the content that's actually the most popular on the internet is not necessarily the content that is forwarding the case of high civilization. And I had a certain thought about this, and it's a thought that I'd like to link with some of the other videos that I've done, because there's a French 18th century writer and philosopher called Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who has been thoroughly discredited in basically all subsequent eras, even though he is more or less the most influential philosopher since Plato, for better or worse. I mean, Rousseau's impact in the modern world is a more massive one than what people maybe recognize. But anyway, I made a video where I was contrasting the Hobbesian and the Rousseauian image of state of nature, and it just occurred to me that basically everyone has taken for granted that there's something completely, well, for the lack of a better word, dumb and naive about the Rousseau state of nature. But as I was mulling over some of the possible responses to the video that Veritasium made about the lack of rise of civilization with these modern instruments, I just kept contrasting Rousseau to these situations, and some of you may or may not know that the second law of thermodynamics, well, it states that the measure of disorder or randomness in a closed system can only increase over time. Now, what Veritasium was talking about when he was sort of saddened by basically the rise of disorder on the internet is that if you look at the stated laws of thermodynamics, in that with the ambitions of civilization, there's more or less only one way to be perfect. There's only one way to be perfectly civilized, and there's infinite ways of that perfection being corrupted. And so what we're seeing is that there's a certain ideal for the civilization that would have that would harness the internet to somehow bring forth the civilization. But what we're seeing is that the entropy in this closed system, with every subsequent moment, the amount of disorder and randomness only increases, and you should be able to see that things are only going to get more disorderly and more random, and the idea that the internet would successfully be harnessed to serving that high civilization that some would want, the impossibility of it should become readily apparent to anyone who knows the laws of thermodynamics. And some people mightn't immediately accept that the laws of thermodynamics will perfectly apply to human society, but just consider the view of history. Like, if you go back to the sort of archaic period of humanity, surely nobody needs to make a very elaborate statement about the peak period of randomness and disorder in the pre-Homeric civilizations. when humanity was at its tribal period, I'd say that um, how civilization develops is that we have overall systems, and let's say that the first system is like Hobbesian state of nature, which is essentially everything against everything. Uh, you know that that is a system that is left there, and it just increases towards disorder and randomness. And then what happens is that we replace that system with something else, so that the system of the Hobbesian state of nature gets replaced with the tribal system. Then the tribal system, it tries to do things right for a while, but then the disorder and randomness of the tribal system keep increasing, and the tribal system is replaced with the system of kingdoms. And then the system of kingdoms, the randomness and disorder keep rising with that system, and it's replaced with empires, so that there's a king who keeps conquering several kingdoms, so that the emperor essentially has like 10 kingdoms, and he rules all of them. If you look at the progress of civilization, in that the progress is one of replacing systems. When the old system becomes random and disorderly, it must be replaced with a new one. So that if you look at the Roman Republic, for instance, it got replaced with the Roman Empire, and then the more the Roman Empire kept progressing, its system became more disorderly and more random the more time went on. And then the system of the Roman Empire was replaced by Christianity. And initially, Christianity was the antithesis to the disorder and randomness of the system of the Roman Empire, and then Christianity became conquering the world. And elsewhere, some other religions also began conquering those parts of the world. What happened again is that if Christianity would be a system, the disorder and randomness just started increasing, so that the Salem witch hunts and the Spanish Inquisition and all of that stuff, it has nothing to do with what Christ was talking about in the Gospels. So that what we see is that the disorder and randomness in the closed system, it could only increase, so that the more time went on, the more Christianity could only become completely incomprehensible when contrasted to its starting point. So that again, the disorder and randomness in a closed system, it could only increase over time. So what people started doing is that they wanted to replace this system with another system. And so scientific materialism started being on the rise with, let's say that the 18th century was a period with very widespread approval of scientific materialism. So that scientific materialism began conquering the world. But again, it's a system, and a system where the disorder and randomness can only increase over time. So what happened is that the people who nominally are en masse approving of rationalism well, I mean, they just say that they approve of rationality, but it's not as if they make any rational decision in their day-to-day lives. They just sort of wave the flag every now and then. And so again, the randomness and disorder in this age of scientific materialism, it just keeps increasing over time. And then what happened is that, there became the kind of 19th century tendency, somewhat linked to the Romantic movement of putting sensibility over sense. And so that the strictness of the 18th century enlightenment and rationality, that was discarded in favor of the, I don't know what to call it, I mean the age of feeling or something. And again, in the 19th century, this overall system of romanticism, it just became more disorderly, more random. It basically became completely meaningless at the end of its era, and it had to be replaced with something else, so that, then there became a period of political theories being worldviews that would be comparable to religions, so that there would be situations that capitalists and communists would fight it out the way that religions would have fought it out during the Crusades or something. And then, in this system of seeing the world through certain political philosophies, the randomness and disorder, they could only increase over a period, and then what the communistic states ended up being as, they don't bear any kind of resemblance to what Marx wrote about. So that if there were communistic countries, it's not as if the workers owned any factories there. It's just that there was a central government that could do whatever it wanted, and the public would just have to accept it, and if they didn't, woe betide them. So that, again, whether communism, capitalism, all they did was just become more disorderly and more random, and that, people were doing one thing and saying another, and, disorder started getting maximized. And then, recently people have tired of those kinds of political philosophies, and the age of the individual, I think, has been a system that has recently taken the world, and again, disorder and randomness keep rising, and this age of the individual will get a counterforce with a system that's I don't know, some sort of a return of the movements which have been getting discarded as people tired of that disorderly system and exchange it for individualism, but people will tire of the individualism, and as randomness and disorder are rising with that, they'll change it to something else. And when they change it to that something else, this cycle of the entropy, well, I mean, the system will change, and as it changes for the worse. And as it changes for the worse, it will be replaced with a different system. So that if we look at the history of Western civilization, it to me seems like a lot of the cyclical movements of history can be explained through thermodynamics. And the way I see it is that it does seem to apply. Now, why did I want to bring Jean-Jacques Rousseau into this conversation? Is because, well, I had the kind of history teachers, for instance, who, well, they were in a competition about who could be the most dismissive towards Rousseau and, you know, who could mock his naivety the most. But if we look towards Rousseau's ideal of the state of nature, to me it seems like Rousseau's state of nature that it's the kind of system where the disorder and randomness, where that process of the entropy, where it wouldn't have started taking place. Now, what everyone will tell Rousseau is that he cannot reverse that process of the disorder and randomness in a closed system only increasing over time. I don't know. I mean, I think that on some level, Rousseau would probably both understand and agree that it is inevitable that a system will become corrupted. That you know, we don't know exactly why it is so just so inevitable, but well, I mean, the best answer is that I mean it's not so much a case that it absolutely, you know, that it absolutely must happen. It's merely there's the highest probability that it will happen, because there are things, you know, when things happen, the probability that something happens that is not the perfect move that keeps the perfection of the system in place. When just one thing happens in an imperfect manner, it changes the system, and there are so many things happening that will be something other than the perfect move that keeps the perfection of the system. It's just so probable that something other than the perfect move will happen, and then when like one thing goes wrong, it changes the system, and then lots of other things will start going wrong, and there's no way to keep the system perfect. Like the amount of imperfect moves is just so much higher that, like, you know, it's just over 99.9999999, and you know, you could just keep adding nines to it. It's just the probability of something other than the perfect move happening. And then, like, when there are so many moves happening, it's just so many of those can be imperfect rather than perfect. it's just like there is the highest probability that a system will become corrupted because the amount of variables in it is just so massively high. In that, honestly, the idea that there could be a person who would look at a given system the way that Jean-Jacques Rousseau looked at his state of nature and hopes to keep that initial perfection. I mean, it does look incredibly naive that a person could possibly believe in it. I don't know exactly how Rousseau would defend his idea that he could keep nature as a perfect closed system. I don't know how he would defend it. Perhaps what would happen is that Rousseau would want to keep his perfect state of nature as the kind of reboot tool, in that there is a starting period of the perfect system of the state of nature, and then it receives a change that humans enter that perfect system of the state of nature, and then that is a change, and then disorder and randomness happen. And the more something keeps happening in the system of the state of nature, the more disorderly and the more random it becomes. And then there will be a period where the disorder and randomness are unendurable. And I suppose the best way that Rousseau could solve this situation is that he'd want to reboot. That it's inevitable that the disorder and randomness keep rising. And then what the state of nature in an ideal state, like, I think the best they could do is to, like, if you could get everyone to go along with the rebooting, like, I'd say that the one strength that the system could possibly have is that if it could essentially neutralize the situation, end the spiral of disorder and randomness, and then just go back to the beginning, and then, well, before long, the disorder and randomness will just keep happening again. And I think that the only thing that Rousseau could possibly do is that, again, when the disorder and randomness start becoming unendurable, you have to reboot the system once again. And what's happening in Western civilization is that there is as if that kind of rebooting, but we're rebooting with different systems. But what Rousseau might put out there is that to him the state of nature is, well, I guess he would call it the best system, and that there's nothing wrong with the system, it's just that it needs to get rebooted because of the entropy. Well, I mean, I guess that's as close as anyone can get to salvaging his idea. But anyway, it just seems strange to me that there is this kind of like people go after Jean-Jacques Rousseau and are on a mad mission to discredit everything to do with him. But like whatever naivete you can hold against Rousseau for believing that he could somehow protect a system from having anything to do with the entropy, is that, well, how does that make Rousseau any different from any other designer of a system? Like, you look at everyone from politics or philosophy or religion or arts or any other field of culture, like there are lots of people who keep designing systems and none of them seem to take into account that the disorder and randomness in a closed system can only increase over time. I can't offhand think of one person who would have taken the second law of thermodynamics into account when they're designing system. But why is Jean-Jacques Rousseau the only person in Western civilization who is somehow pilloried because he's not taking thermodynamics into account? Like, I mean, it just seemed to me that there's like some sort of a pot calling the kettle black situation when, people are getting dismissive over Rousseau, for instance. Anyway, just like Veritasium, when he had hopes for the system of his brand of high civilization getting the internet as a vehicle, just like he wasn't taking the second law of thermodynamics at all into account. It just seems like that's the norm. Like when people have convictions, I think that there is a certain innate optimism for them, and I'd say that like there's a certain secret strength in naivete that I don't think people are recognizing, because like if you could salvage the Rousseauian state of nature through the process of rebooting and fighting entropy by rebooting, I'd say that you could basically do that with everything, in that you recognize that when you put a system in place, the corruption process will start happening, and that corruption process, it's basically, you can't reverse it, but you can fight it through rebooting. It's just that, there are situations where a given actor cannot have such control over a closed system that they could take control over enough of the things in the system that they could get the rebooting. But let's just say that it's theoretically possible that you could fight the disorder through rebooting. I think that what the naivete does is that because it so believes in the initial system, it wants to keep rebooting because it doesn't want to let go of the system that the world cannot help but to corrupt. So that I think that the kind of naivete that would, for instance, keep a person fighting the good fight, I don't think it's at all stupid. I mean, if anything, the naivete would be the only thing in the situation that would be the antithesis of the rise of disorder and randomness. Because if a person has a fairly childish faith to something, it's as if that faith is not in a process of disorder and randomness altering it significantly. Now, obviously, some changes happen, and when people don't get the kind of feedback that they'd want to get, again, that's disorder and randomness rising. But in as much as there can be some sort of a system that you put over the disorder and randomness increasing to fight the disorder and randomness increasing, in as much as you can have something be the antithesis of that chaos, I'd say that that's a strength rather than weakness. However, you know, not being able to see what's going on, I don't think that's exactly much of a strength. So that I think it's like I wouldn't compliment anyone for being oblivious, but I'd say that there's a way in which you can hope to see naivete as something that can have certain secret strengths about it. Uh, I'd say that the way that some people are I think some people give in to the disorder and randomness. Like, it's as if they have gotten taken over by the increasing disorder and randomness, and they compliment themselves for not believing in any system that can be corrupted. But I mean, it's a strange process because I mean, if anything, they think that you shouldn't do something because what you do won't happen the way you want it to happen. Is that you shouldn't do anything because you might lose, but all that's happening is that they've already lost more definitively than what a person should be. Like, they've already lost as definitively as a person can lose, because like they've lost any kind of system to put over the increasing disorder and randomness. They've already become you know, like they've just gone under the disorder and randomness, and then in their chaotic state, they pity anyone who has anything other than disorder and randomness about them. And you know, certainly no person can lie that the entirety of themselves is the antithesis of disorder and randomness, because whatever you are, the disorderliness and randomness of your person will keep increasing over time. But the way to fight it is through that kind of rebooting process, where you're not fighting disorder and randomness. You can't escape disorder and randomness. What you're fighting is that there's a way that disorder and randomness can reach unendurable levels, and through rebooting you can stop that. You fight the unendurable levels in the system, and you know, I'd say that whatever it is that you believe in, if your faith in that can counter the disorder and randomness, and go back to the beginning, whatever it is, shouldn't people be complimented for having something like that? Because clearly that rebooting process is if civilization is the antithesis of the disorder and randomness in the world, wouldn't that type of a system basically, I mean, that is something that's like, you know, a life jacket for a person who is, you know, in the middle of the ocean. Like, whatever it is that that system that you can keep putting over the disorder and randomness, like, you know, that system is the only thing saving all of us from the process of entropy that's out there in the world. So anyway, there would be a way to link it up with some other talks that I've had. I've contrasted the second law of thermodynamics to relationships in some other in some writing of mine, and it seems to me that this process of that the disorder and randomness in a closed system can only increase over time. For instance, anyone who has had a relationship fail, I think that basically invariably there's a situation that the first period in a relationship is always the best, so that it starts great and then the greatness fades and then it turns bad and then fighting happens and then disorder and randomness are, at an all-time high, and the only way to make your life better is by rebooting, so that people basically break up and try with somebody else. It's just that I've just seen some people talk about relationships that seems to resemble Rousseau's state of nature a bit, in that there's like some sort of an image of perfect love, and that, but like in the very first days of the relationship, it can like momentarily, slightly coincide with that view of how love perfectly should be, and then the disorder and randomness, it just starts gradually increasing, and if people can't know how to reboot the relationship, it's basically doomed to end. So that you just need some sort of an ability to reboot it, and then different people do it with varying success. But anyway, given what a lot of the projects that I've been working on recently, that type of seeing the links between relationships and the second law of thermodynamics, it's sort of more well, it's just more linked to what I've been doing recently, but I think that like people should be able to follow the idea that I have without me needing to go too much into that in this video, because like the process is pretty simple. It's just a case of do people believe that the reality of our culture conforms to laws of thermodynamics. It's just a case of do people think that that is just so simply the truth of the world we live in. I have started believing in that being the case. Anyway, I think that this could pretty well be that for this video. And well, I had a certain plan for the video, and perhaps this isn't quite I couldn't quite maybe get where I want to get, but this should be close enough. So anyway, those were my thoughts these were my thoughts on the subject. If you have any other thoughts, you can leave them in the comments. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you in some other videos as well. But anyway, bye bye for now.